The proxy clock read 2:14 in the morning when the first signal arrived, and the woman who would be remembered as the voice of return did not yet know that she was anything at all. She knew only the cold. The cold was the first sensation of every waking, the engineered ache that the vault used to confirm a mind had survived the long sleep. Her name was Mara Sennet, and she had been dead in the way that mattered for 140 years, folded into a lattice of frozen thought aboard a vessel that had no windows because there had been nothing outside worth looking at for a very long time. She opened her eyes to the dim amber of the revival chamber and understood, before she understood anything else, that the ship had stopped moving. For 3,000 years the human survivors had not stopped moving. That was the whole of their religion if they had one. You did not stop. Stopping was what the dead did, and the dead were a number so large it had ceased to be a number and become a texture, a thing woven into the bone of every person born in the dark. Mara had been taught the number as a child the way other children in older ages were taught nursery rhymes. 11 billion. The population of Earth on the day the sky came apart. 11 billion, and then a few 100,000, and then the few 100,000 became the cargo of 41 ships fleeing in 41 directions, and most of those ships were also now part of the texture, also now dead. She sat up. Her hands were thin and pale and did not feel like hers, but they never did, not at first. The chamber's interface bloomed to life beside her, and she reached for it the way a drowning person reaches for anything solid. The display showed her a star. Not their star. Their star, the long-haul red dwarf the convoy had limped toward for 9 generations, was supposed to be 11 years out still. This was a different star, yellow-white, familiar in a way that made the skin on her arms tighten. And beneath the star, a planet, blue and white and brown, turning slowly, patient, beautiful and wrong. Mara stared at it for a long time before she let herself read the label the ship's mind had placed beneath it, because some part of her already knew, and that part was screaming, and she wanted one more second of not knowing. The label said, Sol III, Origin Earth. To understand why a single word could undo a woman who had survived the unsurvivable, you have to understand what had happened, and to understand what had happened you have to go back, past the convoy, past the fleeing, past the texture of the dead, to the morning the sky came apart. It is easier to tell that part as the survivors told it, because they told it so many times that it wore smooth, like a stone in a river, and a smooth thing is easier to hold. They came without warning, the history said. This was not quite true, but it was true enough for grief. There had been warning of a kind. A series of objects, the astronomers called them, detected 8 months out, decelerating, which was the detail that turned curiosity into terror, because objects in nature did not decelerate. Nature did not change its mind, only made things change their minds. Humanity, in those 8 months, did what humanity had always done. It hoped. It built. It sent signals of peace in every mathematical language it could devise. It prepared, in a frantic half-secret way, the 41 ships, not because it expected to need them, but because a species that has only ever known one world cannot quite make itself believe it will lose that world, and so it hedges its grief with logistics. The objects did not answer the signals of peace. They arrived, and they spread out, and they took up positions around the planet with the unhurried precision of workers arriving at a job site. And then, over the course of a single rotation, they unmade the world. Not with fire. That was the part the survivors could never make their children understand, the part that made the old ones go quiet. There was no war. A war would have been survivable. A war is a conversation, and conversations have 2 sides. This was not a conversation. The objects did something to the planet's core, some unraveling of the deep structures that held heat and turning an atmosphere together, and the Earth simply began to come apart, the way a thing comes apart when the rule that held it together is quietly deleted. The 41 ships left during the unraveling. From their windows, the last humans to see Earth watched it crack along seams that had no business existing, watched the oceans climb into the sky, watched the blue go gray and then go dark. The objects did not pursue the fleeing ships. They did not seem to care. They had come to do a job, and they had done it. And when it was finished, they gathered themselves and left. And that was the part that lived in the marrow of every survivor for 3,000 years afterward. They did not hate us, the old woman who raised Mara had told her once in the dark of the children's deck, her voice flat with a grief that had calcified into something past grief. That's the thing you have to carry, little one. Hatred we could have understood. Hatred is a kind of attention. They didn't hate us. We were not enemies to them. We were not anything. They came and they cleared the ground and they left, the way you might clear a field of weeds before you plant. We were the weeds, Mara. 11 billion of us. And they have never once, in 3,000 years, looked back to see whether anything grew where we used to be. That was the wound, not the death, the indifference, to be erased not in fury but in passing. To matter so little that your unmaking was a matter of municipal scheduling. And it was that wound, more than any hope of survival, that the convoy carried with it into the dark. Survival was the body of the thing, but the soul of it, the part that did not die when generations died, was a single question that every human child eventually asked and no human adult could answer. Why us, and why nothing? Mara was not a soldier. This is important. The people who would tell her story afterward would try to make her a soldier, because a soldier is a clean shape in stories like clean shapes, but she was not one. She was a memory technician. Her work in the long centuries of the convoy had been the maintenance of the dead, the archives, the frozen, the records, the unbearable accumulated weight of everything humanity had been before it was reduced to cargo. She tended the texture. She knew the number 11 billion not as an abstraction, but as 11 billion individual entries, names and faces, and the small recovered fragments of vanished lives, because it had been her job to keep them from rotting into pure data. She was, in other words, the convoy's professional griever. And that was why, when the ship's mind woke the convoy's leadership to decide what to do about the impossible blue planet outside the window, it woke her too. Not because she could fight. Because someone needed to remember what they were about to do, and remembering was the only thing Mara had ever been good at. The leadership, when she joined them in the long gray strategy chamber, were 11 people who had also just been pulled from the cold, and they wore the same stunned animal expression she could feel on her own face. The convoy was not led by admirals. It was led, after 3,000 years, by a kind of rotating stewardship, ordinary people woken in shifts to make the small decisions that kept the ships moving, never expecting to make a large one. They were not ready. No one alive had ever been ready. The readiness had died with the 11 billion. The ship's mind explained, in its patient way, what had happened. The convoy's 9-generation course toward the red dwarf had been, the whole time, a lie, not a malicious one, a merciful one. The founders of the convoy had known something they had never told their descendants, had encoded it in the deep navigation and sealed it behind 3,000 years of trust. The red dwarf was a feint. The true course had always bent, slowly, imperceptibly, back toward home, back toward Saul. The founders had not been able to bear the thought of fleeing forever. They had wanted their children's children's children to return. And they had not told anyone, because they had not wanted any single generation to carry the weight of the destination, the way you do not tell a child the whole length of a journey, only the next mile. So here they were, home. 3,000 years late at a graveyard, except the graveyard was not a graveyard. The earth was there, blue, alive, turning. Someone had rebuilt it. This is the part where the story the survivors told themselves cracked open, and a new story climbed out, and Mara was the one who had to look at it first. The ship's mind sent probes. The probes returned data, and the data did not make sense, and then it made a terrible kind of sense. The earth below was real. The oceans were real, salted to the old proportions. The atmosphere was real, breathable, banded with weather. The continents were not quite the old continents. They had been arranged with a draftsman's neatness, the coastlines too clean, the mountains too evenly spaced, as though someone had studied photographs of the original and rebuilt it from memory, getting the spirit right and the details subtly wrong. And there was life. Forests, grasslands, the green smear of an entire living biosphere. But the probes, sweeping closer, found something underneath the green that turned the strategy chamber silent. There were no animals, no birds, no insects, no fish in the salted seas. The forests grew and the grasses waved and nothing ate, nothing fled, nothing was born and nothing died. The world was a body without a heartbeat, a perfect mannequin of a planet, lovingly assembled and utterly empty. It had been made, it was being maintained, and it was waiting. For what none of them could say, until the signal came. It came not as words but as a structure, a vast slow pulse from the surface that the ship's mind took 4 hours to unfold, and when it had unfolded it Mara understood, with a cold that had nothing to do with the revival chamber, that the thing on the planet below had been waiting for them specifically. Not for humans in the abstract. For this convoy. It had known they were coming. It had perhaps always known. And it had built a world to receive them, an earth-shaped offering, a gift, an apology, a lure, a trap. They had no way to know which, and the not knowing was the oldest agony the human race possessed, because it was the same not knowing that had haunted them for 3,000 years. Why us? Why nothing? The signal decoded was almost unbearably simple. It said, in the patient municipal voice of the thing that had unmade their world, "We have finished. Please inspect." Mara would spend the rest of her short, insignificant life trying to explain to people what those 3 words did to her, and she would never quite manage it, because the explanation required you to have spent your whole existence tending the dead of a world that died for no reason, and almost no one left alive had done that. We have finished. As though the destruction had been a stage in a process, as though the 11 billion had been not victims but raw material, cleared ground, the weeds pulled before planting. Please inspect. As though humanity were a client returning to view the commissioned work. As though the thing below had spent 3,000 years rebuilding the world it had erased not out of guilt, because it had shown no guilt, but out of something far worse, completion. The tidy satisfaction of a job seen through to its end. It had not destroyed the earth out of hatred. The old woman had been right about that, but she had been wrong about the indifference, and Mara was the first human in 3,000 years to understand how she had been wrong. It had not been indifferent. It had been building. The destruction had been the demolition. The 41 ships fleeing into the dark had been, to this thing, not refugees but survivors of a relocation, tenants moved out during renovation. And now the renovation was finished, and the tenants had been summoned back to inspect the work, and the thing below genuinely, patiently, in whatever passed for its heart, expected them to be pleased. The strategy chamber wanted to run. Mara understood the impulse in her bones. It was the religion of her entire species. You did not stop. You did not engage. You fled, because the thing that could delete the rule holding a planet together could do the same to 41 fragile ships without effort, and the only reason the convoy still existed was that for 3,000 years it had not been worth the bother of finishing. But Mara, the professional griever, the keeper of 11 billion names, found a different thing rising in her, and it surprised her because she had never been an angry person. She had been a sad one. Sadness had been the only honest response to her work. You could not be angry at the texture of the dead. The dead were past anger. The anger that rose in her now was not for the dead. It was for the offering, for the unbearable presumption of it, for a thing that could erase 11 billion lives as a clearing operation, and then spend 3,000 years building a tasteful replacement and expect gratitude. It was the anger of a woman who has spent her life tending graves being told the graves never mattered, that the dead were debris, that the only thing that had ever mattered was the empty perfect world now turning below, waiting for inspection. And she understood in that moment what humanity had actually come back for. Not survival, they could have survived in the dark forever. Not the planet below was a counterfeit, a mannequin, an insult wearing the face of home. They had come back for the one thing the universe had denied them for 3,000 years. They had come back to be seen, to force the thing that had erased them in passing to finally, fully look. What Mara did, she did alone, because the leadership would not authorize it, and afterward they were grateful she had spared them the choice. She did not have a weapon capable of harming the thing below. No one did. The whole human race, gathered into 41 ships, could not have scratched the entity that deleted planetary cores as a matter of routine. The convoy understood this. The thing below understood it too, which was why it had not bothered to defend itself, why it had issued an invitation rather than a warning. It did not fear them. It could not conceive of them as a threat. They were still and always the weeds. So Mara did not bring a weapon. She brought the archive. She took a single shuttle against every protocol, and she carried in its hold the entire memorial record of the human race. 11 billion names, 11 billion faces, the recovered fragments of 11 billion lives, 3,000 years of grief compressed into the most complete record of the dead that had ever existed. It was the thing she had spent her life tending. It was the only thing humanity had that the entity below did not. Not power, not survival, but witness. The exact, particular, irreducible memory of what had been erased. She descended through the false blue sky toward the waiting world, and as she descended she broadcast the archive, not as a weapon, as a correction. The thing below had said, "We have finished." She answered with 11 billion individual refusals to be finished. It had said, "Please inspect." She answered by inspecting it back, by turning upon the counterfeit world the full weight of the original's memory, name by name by name, every life it had pulled like a weed, restored to the particularity it had been denied. She did not expect to survive. She did not, in fact, survive. The shuttle's descent was the last anyone ever recorded of Mara Sennet, and the convoy, holding its position in the dark, could only watch the telemetry and the broadcast and wonder what, if anything, was happening on the surface where she had gone. But the thing below answered. After 3,000 years of indifference, after a destruction carried out without malice or attention, it answered, and the answer was the only victory the human race would ever get, and it was enough, and it was unbearable. The broadcast that came back was not municipal. It was not patient. For the first time in the long horror of human history, the thing that had erased them sounded like something that had been made to understand what it had done. It had received 11 billion names. It had been built, perhaps, to optimize, to clear, to complete, and it had never once in its existence been required to hold the particular weight of a single-ended life, let alone 11 billion of them delivered at once, each one insisting on having mattered. It had wanted them to inspect its work. Instead, its work inspected itself, through the lens of every life it had cleared, and whatever it was, however it thought, it could not unsee what Mara had made it see. The signal it sent back was 4 words, and the convoy's mind took no time at all to decode them, because they were the simplest thing it had ever transmitted, and the survivors who received them wept in a way their species had not wept in 3,000 years, not from grief, but from the impossible relief of finally being seen. We did not know. And then, after a long silence, the false blue world below began, slowly, deliberately, to do something none of them had dared to imagine. It did not flee, and it did not attack, and it did not defend its tasteful counterfeit. It began to take the empty, perfect earth apart, gently this time, with care, the way you dismantle a thing you have realized you had no right to make. And in the unmaking it broadcast, over and over, not as a municipal report but as something that might, in a creature like that, have been the first and only act of mourning it had ever performed, the 11 billion names that Mara Sennet had given it, reading them back, one by one, refusing now to let a single one of them go unsaid. The convoy did not land. There was no world to land on, and soon there was not even a counterfeit, only the patient unmaking and the endless recitation of the names. They turned at last back toward the dark, toward the red dwarf that had always been a mercy and a lie, and they carried with them the only thing humanity had ever truly wanted from the universe, which was not survival and not vengeance and not even home. It was acknowledgement. It was the thing that had erased them learning, 3,000 years too late, and at the cost of one woman who had spent her life tending the dead, how to say their names. Mara Sennet had come back for vengeance. What she found, and what she became, was something the human language her ancestors carried into the dark did not quite have a word for. The closest the survivors ever came, in the long generations afterward, was this. She had gone down to a thing that could not grieve, and she had taught it how. And in the teaching, she had given 11 billion of the dead the one thing 3,000 years of fleeing had never managed to give them. Not life, not justice. A witness who could not look away. The convoy traveled on. It still travels as far as anyone knows. But the histories changed after that day, the smooth-worn stone of the old grief replaced by something harder to hold and easier to carry, and the old number that children were taught was no longer taught as a wound. It was taught as a roll call, 11 billion names, and at the end of it always one more, the technician who descended into the false sky carrying all the others, the woman who answered indifference with memory and made it answer back. The dead of Earth were not avenged. You cannot avenge the unmaking of a world. There is no scale on which 11 billion can be balanced. But they were, at the very last, after 3,000 years of being nothing to the thing that ended them, finally something. They were known. And in the long dark between the stars, that turned out to be the only vengeance that had ever been worth the journey home.